Thank you, everyone, for watching the Gold Silver Bitcoin show brought to you by the GoldSilverBitcoin.com store. We are honored to be sitting down today with Thomas Quinlin. He's the founder of Patriot Energy Systems. Thank you so much, Thomas, for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
I want to talk today about the white paper that you've penned. It's called Decentralized Power, Compensating for a Fragile Electrical Grid Breakdown and Failure. But before we get too far into that, I wanted to ask you if you could explain what Patriot Energy Systems is for those who don't know.
Well, in engineering jargon, which confuses everybody, what we do is we manufacture electrical management systems. So in plain English, that the bulk of us can understand, including people like me, what that means is we make electrical generators. And we make them that these generators that we manufacture are, they get their energy source from, say, solar, wind, hydroelectric, as well as hydrocarbon sources. And they come in various sizes, but the primary purpose of these machines, if you will, are to power homes that are off-grid, although we've had a very large interest from people who are on-grid for reasons that we'll probably likely discuss in our conversation today.
Great. So I'm reading the white paper, Decentralized Power, Compensating for a Fragile Electrical Grid Breakdown and Failure. And it says, in the future, decentralized electricity will drive the marketplace. The first paragraph reads, quote, worldwide centralized grids, both renewable and non-renewable, are becoming prohibitively expensive to design, build, and manage. There are concerns, whether founded or unfounded, that certain types of power generation plants, such as coal, oil, and nuclear fission-based systems, are problematic in dealing with waste. Even solar has some problems with this regarding the proper disposal of solar panels. So can you maybe expound a little bit on that problem?
Yeah, I would say that with the issue of energy, initially as a society, we were very lucky. While we clearly are involved in renewable energy sources and building our generators, and including, by the way, hydrocarbon backup systems, we were very lucky when the oil and later on the gas systems of the world began to really provide us with cheap ongoing energy. These systems also were designed to be scaled up to handle what was eventually going to be a large part of the population. And we've become so dependent on this energy. I mean, it just affects literally every part of our lives, not just the obvious things like getting a light turned on or perhaps cooking, but everything depends on us being able to not just simply obtain energy, but obtain it consistently, reliably, and with much resilience, which means that when there is a problem, you can get things back up again quickly. And so the problems that have been seen with traditional types of energy, primarily coal and oil, as well as, say, fission reactors, has been really the issue of what to do with the waste products. The waste issues in coal and oil provide us with some background on this, particularly with regards to smog and things that get into the water, that get into the climate. And then the things with regards to fission have to do with what to do with the waste products of primarily plutonium, since it has a half-life of 25,000 years. It's not just something you can set aside and hope it'll go away. However, acknowledging that we've had those problems, and in fact, many of those problems have been substantially addressed in the last 20 years by the private sector. I would say that all of the energy sources that we are now involved with, which include, again, hydrocarbons, all have their ups and they all have their downs. So what my perspective is looking at this is very much the same perspective that I would take, say, with other major issues such as, say, climate change. I, like many other people, have an opinion about climate change, as well as energy source systems. But I tend to look at them a bit different philosophically, which drives all my decision-making process. And that is, when we have these various sources of energy, what does it do to the human race? And does it make the human race work better, work more efficiently? Does it make our lives better, or does it tend to, in total, make our lives worse? because the secret that I'm sure everybody knows is that any kind of energy source, whether we're talking hydrocarbons, solar, wind, whatever, they all have peculiarities about them. Some of them are good, and some of them are not so good. And it's just a matter of having the technology to address those things over time. So the big issue that the white paper addressed, the overall encompassing issue was, well, then what is it in the future that we can do to help address many of these problems? And so that's where the whole idea of decentralizing power systems came up. There's all kinds of things that wrap into that, such as blackouts and corruption within the utility industry and pollution and all this stuff. But all of these things actually end up becoming more easily addressed when you begin to unpack this major centralized grid system that has developed really around the world, and can provide us with solutions to unplug from that system while not having to alter our lifestyles in a major sort of way.
You mentioned this, and I think in terms of systems and the more decentralized these systems are, regardless of what kind of system it is, perhaps the healthier each individual system could be, and then also the system, these smaller systems comprise a larger system. So like the internet's a network of networks, and perhaps theoretically the more networks which comprise the overarching internet, the more secure and decentralized the internet is or could be. I think similarly about decentralization generally. So we're looking at, say, the geopolitical landscape of today, and there's decentralizing factors and centralizing factors. And so I staunchly align with the decentralizing factors because I think they're safe, they're sturdier, to borrow a term by Nasib Taleb, hyperfragile. Can you maybe speak to the soundness of decentralized systems generally, and how they apply to the electrical grid too?
Yeah, and I think it's a key point, actually, Justin. If you take a look, the issue with a highly centralized system is that when one part of that system breaks down, and there could be a myriad of causes of this, some of it man-made, most of it not, then the entire system is then stressed. So to give you an idea, in the US, we have a very small number of major grid transport systems. There are effectively 5 major grids in the US. If one goes down, the system then takes up the slack by bringing in energy from the other grid systems within the US. These are major grid systems. However, what's not so well known is that by doing this, you then put stress on those existing grid systems. So if you have, say, 3 grids that for whatever reason went down, and you had the remaining 2 left over, it is very likely that if you tried to then support those down 3 systems, the remaining 2 grids would probably break down as well and just simply drop. So that is, to me, a major issue with regards to centralized systems. We can get into some of the major of the issues that are perhaps not quite so large. Like, I think that the centralized grid systems are very politicized, and there's a lot of corruption in them. It's very spendy. It's not very efficient. But the big thing that I look at is energy was developed to make life easier for human beings. That's why we use it. Without energy, we can't run our machines. It is our machines that have allowed us as a civilization to leverage our power, to do things that we could never do before. And without a cheap source of energy, that comes to a grinding halt. And the problem with centralized systems is that when you throw one wrench into the system, it can potentially bring the rest of the system down, particularly if the system is old and needs to be updated but hasn't. And so you've got issues of resiliency as well as reliability.
In the next paragraph of the white paper, you write, blackouts are becoming more common as the grid ages. Prolonged blackouts in Louisiana following Hurricane Ida are a reminder the power grid needs to become more resilient, i.e. critical parts of the electrical supply system can mitigate, survive, and or recover from high impact threats, as well as reliable. The lights always come on when you throw the switch. If even more services, such as electric vehicles, are going to depend on it in the future, Can you expand on that point, perhaps, in context of what you've just said?
Yeah, the issue with centralization goes way beyond the renewable versus non-renewable discussion, because the renewable versus non-renewable discussion means that you're looking at how is everything sourced, versus what I'm talking about is how is everything distributed once you create it. And so you can have all the great sources of the world, but if you can't distribute something effectively, then you're really in a position where you're not operating efficiency. And so, excuse me, efficiently. So this concept, particularly in the future, the goal of most of the utilities is to continue to bring everything under one umbrella, despite the fact that we're actually moving away from alternative sources of energy. So for example, if we have a blackout today in a particular city, you have other options. You could, for example, use gasoline or propane or other forms to kind of keep you going if you needed to go. In the future, we're on top of everything else, we're going to be really driving that load with, say, with the introduction of electric cars and other things that may not run off of electricity today, but will in the future, for example, like heating. Then what happens is that your options begin to fall away pretty quickly. And so what it does, it actually exacerbates the problem of not only when a blackout exists or when there's a flaw in the system that breaks down, it has a cascading effect. So all those cascading effects that we see nowadays when a grid or a partial grid go down and you have to stress out other grids in order to bring energy into that down system, this is going to become even more noticeable in the future. And all of this is based on continuing to have a centralized grid that not only would be in the US, but very conceivably in North America. There would be an umbrella system working together. And in places like Europe and Africa, everything under a highly centralized system there that not only makes it very difficult to deal with even small problems, but then these systems by definition are going to be politicized. Who's going to get energy at what time if something breaks down? Who stands in line? So the big problem I have with that is that it takes the final decision away from the ultimate customer, the user, the person that needs that energy. And so, for example, in cases like even in Africa, there's still places there where people don't have the energy available to them that we have here in the US. And people are suffering greatly because of it.
Reminds me of a text message I got from a marketer, a leading marketer on the planet. And it's very interesting because he puts content out at scale, and because he believes that's the way in which to first and foremost be seen and heard, and then also to learn what people want to hear about. And over the course of his journey, he's increasingly become like motivational, telling people to believe in themselves. And the text message he sent out last night was essentially like, we have so much to be grateful for. You should just be filled with gratitude and just happy to be alive. And there's people without even clean water in parts of the world. So like, don't stress about whatever business thing that is on your plate today. And that's really the message that he's arrived at, that people need to hear. He sees that people need to hear that. In the next section of the white paper, you discuss EMPs, man-made and God-made. Of course, those are electromagnetic pulses. You write, the US security system has been well aware of the threat posed by Chinese military doctrine. Chinese military writings are replete with references to making hemp high-altitude electromagnetic pulse attacks against the US as a means in prevailing in a war. Even worse and even greater concern must be directed to EMP generated by solar flares. On April 2nd, 2001, the sun unleashed the biggest solar flare ever recorded. It was more powerful than the famous solar flare on March 6, 1989, which disrupted power grids all over Canada. The ejection of mass, which barely bypassed the Earth, was thrown into space at an incredible speed of 7.2 million kilometers per second. Can you perhaps elaborate upon the EMP threat, and then also how a decentralized energy grid might mitigate some concerns?
Yeah, because again, that's a very good question that we should be addressing. So try to keep this as non-science as possible. EMP, or electromagnetic pulse, comes in three different pulse types. We refer to it as E1, E2, or E3. E1 and E2 happen to be, generally speaking, from man-made sources. E3 pulses generally come from nature, and primarily solar flares, although there's some magnetic activity that goes on within the Earth itself that can create EMP. So when you're looking at EMP from the perspective of E1 and E2, what you have typically there are very short-term but intense pulses. These can be hundreds of thousands of volts per square millimeter. So we're talking very large sums of energy coming in and having some effect on the system. The E3 impulse is a little bit different in that it is a larger, what we call a larger wavelength, and the damage that it causes is from a different perspective than E1 and E2. So the E1, E2 pulses typically tend to do their damage within seconds, at literally nanoseconds or milliseconds. Just boom, it comes, and then things get disrupted. Primarily what gets affected the most are the low voltage applications that we didn't have prior to really 1970 and 1960s. So anything that runs on 5 or 12 volts is what's going to be affected. Higher voltage materials, higher voltage machines tend not to be as affected by E1, E2 pulses. E3 pulses, on the other hand, can be extremely damaging to not just simply low voltage, but even high voltage sources. The reason for this is that we have a lot of our electrical grid system connected through towers and primarily underground systems. These underground wires act like an antenna. And like all antennas, they tend to accentuate signals and make them stronger. So while these wavelengths are measured in terms of seconds, like several seconds, as opposed to, say, E1 and E2 pulses, which can be a millionth of a second in terms of what we're measuring there, those larger impulses get amplified through the system. And so not only can they create damage at the transfer circuits of most grids, which are low voltage, but they can also have an impact on the higher voltage connecting wires, as well as the transmission stations with regards to the resistors that are used and the components that they're using, because this signal is so amplified. So part of this problem that we've had with EMP was that, frankly, prior to the 70s, whether it was dangerous or not to us as human beings was an open question and not really well researched. There's no question, though, that since we now so depend on low voltage systems, but just take computers as an example, even the computer systems in your cars would be affected. Now it becomes a very big way to take a look at how to survive one of these events. So the way that we've designed this, well, let me back up a second. So you can go ahead and actually address these systems under a concentrated, cohesive, say, system that is centralized, but it's not easy and it's not cheap. On a decentralized system, there's a couple of new technologies out that can address with regards to EMP items, both the systems that we make, but also systems for decentralized electrical systems, decentralized systems that are providing energy to homes. And so the homes now can also pretty effectively and quite inexpensively be protected against EMP as well. Because if you have a system, say that's a decentralized system, and it's working fine, and you get an EMP pulse and it runs through your main service from the utility, all of the items that are plugged into your plug in the house are going to get fried from potentially affected by the EMP signal as well. So we actually put in EMP signals into the main panel. We will also have them put into customers' automobiles, which are very easy to do and very inexpensive to do, so that it doesn't affect the ignition system in the event of an EMP. And then we also make sure that we have our systems not only protected on what we call the AC range, but we also protect them on the DC range. So those items, for example, that can get very much affected on decentralized systems, or if you have solar, for example, the wiring can be affected in the solar. Inside the inverter systems, they have smaller systems or voltages in there that could be affected. So they need to be protected as well. Interestingly enough, batteries were not at one point a big concern because batteries had very thick cables and EMP generally did not affect them. However, now with the new batteries such as lithium that have battery management systems, they do operate off a low voltage. So now we have to figure out a way to protect them as well. So in general, the idea of protecting EMP on a centralized system versus a decentralized system is that, and it goes back to the main premise, which is if the EMP works, and generally it does, but there's never any guarantee. If you don't have a redundant system set up in a centralized system, then all it takes is one time the system breaks down, the safety system, and now you're back to the same issues of, well, what got ruined? And in the case of an EMP event, it could be catastrophic. I mean, it could be where nothing will work again. You have the same issue with a decentralized system, except you have a lot more systems out there to rebut that kind of an attack if it happens.
In the white paper, you write, in the rush to electrify the entire energy system, policymakers may be inadvertently also increasing the vulnerability of society in the event of a large area, long duration power failure. So, what is likely in store for users of electricity in the future, rather than several closely connected but separate systems for electricity, gas, oil, and transport, the future, there will be increasingly only one very tightly integrated system, increasing its vulnerability to catastrophic failure. The risk created by linking formerly separate systems into a central system prone to a single point of failure has been understood for decades. In particular, the more tightly coupled systems become, the greater the risk an unanticipated problem in one part could cascade through the whole. At present, blackouts render some services unavailable, lighting, power, but households and businesses may be able to use other sources of energy, gas heating, gasoline vehicles. In the future, blackouts could disrupt substantially all energy services. Thus, it is critical that access to all forms of energy production be available to the public. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, as someone who's a manufacturer in the private sector, what I tend to look at trends. And the trend that we're seeing really around the world, not just in the US, but all over the world. In fact, I'd argue that certain parts of the world, it's even being accelerated much more than we're seeing here, is that there is an acceleration towards having systems, whether they are political systems or economic systems or living systems, more and more brought together into a highly centralized pocket. And whether you're talking about political systems or engineering systems, or whether you're talking about just everyday life, the problem with a highly centralized system, regardless of what kind of a system you're talking about, is that A, it tends to become less efficient. B, when something breaks down, it affects the system as a whole. That's just, it's almost axiomatic that one has to look at that, and there's not much you can do to deny it. It's just this overwhelming proof that this happens. So the fact that what I see as an individual, larger attempts by both, when I say that the utility system, by the way, they're so monopolized, and they have such a large amount of privileges from the government. They're really part of the government. And so when you see that, what happens is that now services are not just simply derived from a highly centralized and I'm drawing a blank on a word here, forgive me, exposed system, if you will. But things also start to become a little politicized as to who gets what and when can they get it. So you don't really have an efficient way for people to, some people just need more energy than others. Some companies need more energy than others. Some entities such as hospitals and perhaps military stations, for example, they have a higher need than others, or whether it's actual or not, their perception is they have a higher need. And so by using backup systems now, it's a way to address that which means if we continue to go in the same direction we're going versus, say, decentralizing something. Because in a decentralized system, you're still going to have problems. You're going to have some resiliency issues. You're going to have reliability issues. But at least when it happens, it'll happen in such a way that is to not impact everybody in the system. So to give you a good example how that might work, we're working with several different potential customers right now. But if you take a look at, say, someone who's building a home project of 40 homes, and they decide rather than tie into the grid, we don't need to get into reasons why they would or wouldn't, but let's assume that they just decide that that's where they want to go. They're not going to tie into the grid, and they're going to have their own energy solution that is, let's say, for all practical purposes, belongs to the project. It's their energy. So they become their own, if you will, they become their own grid. Typically, these microgrids, as we call them, they tend to be independent or quasi-independent from the main grid. When I say quasi-independent, the grid may come back, for example, and interact with this in a positive way. So for example, there are grid companies right now, utility companies, that are now putting out feelers for people, say, like some of our customers who have their own systems, and then they have a large, anywhere from a medium to a very large amount of backup storage capability. Well, most grids don't have any capability of storing energy. When they make it, it either gets used or it's dissipated in heat or voltage loss, which comes across as heat dissipation. So if the grids could find enough people who are independent and have large energy storage, what they're doing now is they're offering them cross agreements where they'll be able to store that energy until they need it, pull it off the grid, and then be able to use it more efficiently. So when you have, however, in a non-centralized system, let's assume that those systems had even decentralized parts. So for example, if we had a system that needed 100,000 watts in order to be able to provide enough energy for 40 homes, if that was the number, rather than put that into one station, we would typically even decentralize even more by having, say, anywhere from 5 to 10 versus stations, each of which are connected. But if one goes down, the other stations can still stay up while you're repairing the one station that's down. So it may impact somewhat if you had, like, the majority of these things break down for some reason, say like in an EMP event, and you didn't have proper EMP protection. But still, it's still going to be better than if you have one system that goes down and drags everybody else with it. Or worse, you have a section of the grid goes down, and then the result of that is that the rest of the grids that are operating now have to take up the slack, where they risk being going down. Because again, there hasn't been much repair work done to our systems in the last 100 years. Those systems that were originally put together, many of them still have the original wiring under the ground. And copper and aluminum, those types of wirings, they just corrode after a while. They become worth less. And if you don't keep them up, they're going to become very problematic.
You write under the section grid resilience that essentially policymakers will need to pay more attention to the reliability of the electricity system. You cite a study published by the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, published in 2017, in which enhancing the resilience of the nation's electricity system was the focus of the research. You write also that large area, long duration interruptions to electric service occur much more frequently than most users assume, with much more serious consequences. Do you have anything to add to the section here on grid resilience?
Well, again, recognizing that the term resilience means when something breaks, how quickly can it be fixed? That's resilience. And so when you have parts that get old, I mean, look at me, I'm not as resilient as I was 30 years ago, unfortunately. And when you're dealing with anything that's metal, that's potentially corrosive over a period of time, things just break down. And so the idea of resilience is going to always be around. So whether we have a centralized system or a decentralized system, resilience becomes, it's always going to be there, an issue that needs to get addressed, as with reliability. It goes back, though, to my initial premise, which is, all right, if we want a system that's going to most benefit humanity, what would that system what are the elements of that system? And one of them would be that when you have these problems or issues that crop up, whether it's reliability, resilience issues, that the amount of people that it impacts is minimized. So it's the issues still rear their heads. They still have to be addressed. They still have to be fixed. But hopefully it's done so in a way that it doesn't create hardships on the bulk of the people who are either directly or indirectly tied into that particular system.
Under the section massive blackouts, you write, in the last 40 years, North America has seen a series of large blackouts that have interrupted service to at least 10,000 megawatts of customer load, the equivalent to the entire peak power demand of New York City. You then list some of the events that have happened in the last 30 years. And then continue on. Officials considered evacuating cities or moving residents to facilities. Disruptions rippled through food supply chains, transportation, communications, and other economic activities for weeks in certain cases. Now, I think one of your theses is that the frequency of such events is increasing. And I think we've even kind of seen that in the last year and a half in some ways. So I remember back kind of in a longer range of time back in like 2012, I want to say in Southern California, there was a blackout that lasted approximately, I want to say, I guess it must have approached 24 hours, in which a large swath of people in a conglomeration that is Southern California were without power. And of course, those with the Patriot energy systems back then would have been just fine. The consequences will become even more severe in the future if more and more energy services are moved from other systems, such as gasoline, diesel, and natural gas, onto the electric grid. They just banned gas construction, gas utilities in homes in cities where some of my family members live. Policymakers, regulators, and utilities must therefore focus on improving reliability and resilience at the same time as electrification and decarbonization to minimize the threat of catastrophic failure. Before we kind of move on to the next session of grid investment, I guess if you were a representative or even president, what steps would you take on the national level to ensure that the nation's electrical grid became more resilient?
In answering that question, there would be a short-term effect and a long-term effect, which is first of all, that's one reason I'd never be a politician. But so what I would tend to look at, again, because what I look at is what in the long run is in the best interest for the human race. And I know it's very philosophical and it's not very science, but that's what I believe. And so I think because I have a belief in humanity, that as a species, we're highly evolved. And number two, as particularly as Americans, we tend to be, when left to our own selves, we can be very intuitive, and we can be very clever with how we take technology and use it to our advantage. So the first thing I would do, honestly, if it was in my power, even though it might have some short-term negative ramifications, would be, first of all, I would deregulate everything. I would deregulate electricity. I would get government out of it. I would turn it over to the private sector and let the private sector decide what areas of their energy, whether you're talking about energy building or energy use or energy storage, let the public decide what they want to do. There is more than enough constructive capital out there to address these very important issues. And you don't need the government involved. Typically, all they do is they take a cut out of it and they force the rest of us to put money into, pay into a government project at the point of a gun. And then we have very little control over how these things get addressed in the long run. So that's the first thing I would do. I would deregulate. And then secondly, what I would do is if we were fully deregulated, I would allow for an open, frank discussion about the various forms of energy, how it is made, and then how is it distributed. So for example, discussions that are really, It's hard in the US today to have a discussion with anyone, particularly if you're at odds, if you don't agree with someone. It would be hard, if I had one perspective on climate change and you had another, most of the time it ends up being a screaming match, as opposed to saying, hey, here's my position, here's my backup, and you could say, well, here's my position, here's my backup. In the case of energy, for example, I think there's been way too much emphasis on renewable sources such as solar and wind. The fact of the matter is that they're not nearly as efficient as hydrocarbons. Not nearly. I mean, it's not even close. And rather than being grateful for what hydrocarbon fuels have done to absolutely transform the way that we live as a society, we try to badmouth it. And the reasons that we badmouth it are, say, for example, pollution. The big issue now is that we're increasing carbon dioxide, for example, in the atmosphere. And honestly, there's no scientific proof that I've seen that shows that adding carbon dioxide into the atmosphere does anything bad. So even the basic premise of these discussions are hard to find. I'm finding that more and more science is going from basic science research, which is question everything. There is no such thing as truth when you're talking about science, to where we're going to is just simply consensus. A bunch of people get together and they make a consensus, and then it's considered to be the truth. It's considered to be dogma, and you're not allowed to discuss it. So the two things I would do is, number one, I would get the government out of this altogether. Number two, what I would do is I would then encourage open dialogue about what would be the advantages of moving on to other forms of energy. There's strong arguments on both sides of this. And what would be the advantage of maintaining hydrocarbons? What would be the disadvantage of it? And regardless about how I feel, at least it would be nice to get this stuff out in the open so we can at least start talking about it. Versus now, what I see is that there really isn't much of a discussion. It just seems to be mostly arguing and screaming back and forth. And people have lost the ability in the US today, in my opinion, to debate things openly. And, we can have disagreements. In fact, most people that know me probably disagree with just about everything I say, but it's okay. I got my opinion. But it's when you try to shut down discussions over any issues, particularly on energy, it's that when things get clogged up and then nothing gets done. So those would be the two biggest things I think I would do. And by the way, I don't know, Justin, that it would have a short-term bad effect. I think certainly long-term, it would be a really positive effect. And we could just as easily see positive aspects come from that right away.
I think when people hear deregulate, and give it over to the free market or private enterprise, they hear, oh, you just want some mega corporations to be controlling everything and we'll live in a corporatocracy. However, I think they fail to understand the importance of government subsidy and the role of special interest in allowing these major, massive corporations to exist.
Yep.
And arguably in a free market, you would have more decentralization because you wouldn't have crony capitalism, for instance, in which there's favors being exchanged between the private sector and the government sector and taxpayer money being funneled to certain companies, which then turn into these mega corporations than we have today. Any
I
thoughts on
couldn't agree
that?
with you. I couldn't agree with you more on that, Justin. I think that we don't live under really a free enterprise capitalistic system, and what's really a mercantile system that was very similar to what we saw in Italy during the Second World War. If you have companies and they're free to compete back and forth, I think that's a good thing. In fact, we've thought about going and actually patenting many of our systems that we make, and we decided against it. And the reason was that, competition is not such a bad idea. It keeps prices down. It encourages innovation. And if people are copying us, well, that's the highest form of flattery. And so but when you say, well, it's going to go over to the big companies. Well, if you have a grid system, and let's just say it's a utility company, and you privatize it, you take away all the government protection, you take away all the government liability that they get. Look what the pharmaceutical companies have. They have no liability at all. So of course, you're not going to have very stringent safety issues that's going to come up. In the utility industry, they get the same kind of blanket, limited, but just about entirely unlimited immunity. No one goes to jail if there's a disastrous effect from one of the utility companies. For example, the fire that was last year in California, I can't remember how many acres, and started from a transformer from PG&E. it caused like, I think it was nearly over $1 billion of damage. No one was ever even called to task on that. I mean, not that somebody was or was not guilty, but no one took responsibility for it. And eventually who paid for all that were the public. They paid through tax dollars because of the heavy subsidies that the utility industry gets. And this gets back to the section that you read in my paper about how the utility companies are actually fining people for their own mistakes through these various organizations and charities that they found. I was abhorrent when I read this stuff. I couldn't believe that this was going on. And I mentioned in the paper, it was very difficult for me to get any information on these organizations at all. They don't want you to know about this stuff. So the whole idea of thinking, well, we can't turn this over to the private sector because it's big companies. That's not the private sector. In fact, I would say that the decentralization of the utility companies across the US, much less across the world, I would argue that that's not necessarily such a bad thing at all. It doesn't mean they can have service agreements and reciprocal agreements. They're free to contract as private companies any way they feel is moral and legal. So I would say, what's so bad about that?
I saw a presentation by PGE, I think in 2019, about how they want to incorporate blockchain into their grid, essentially. And what I find with these big corporations is that they've co-opted this term blockchain and they're throwing it around, giving lip service to this concept of decentralization. But when they're talking about blockchain, what they're really discussing is a distributed ledger, which is slightly different than a blockchain. So a blockchain maybe is perhaps more decentralized and formed through spontaneous chaos, if you will, where anybody can join a network and become a node or become, in the Bitcoin example, a miner. Whereas in a distributed ledger, it's more of a permission-based system. So whereas PGE argues they're setting up a blockchain type grid or experimenting with it, it's distributed ledger because not anybody is going to be able to plug their Patriot energy system into this grid and join it in an open exchange of, say, energy, et cetera. Rather, you're going to need permission from the state of California, for instance, or from PGE to join this system. So what we'll have is that the only participants in this network, this distributed ledger network, are the state of California, PGE, maybe say the city of San Francisco, the city of Los Angeles. So now you've got really more like a cartel formation rather than a truly decentralized formation. And then, so kind of digging a little deeper into the grid investment, you write, boosting resilience often requires hardening transmission and distribution systems by undergrounding wires, replacing wooden pools with concrete ones, strengthening towers, stockpiling replacement transformers, and raising substations above potential flood levels. More generally, electricity systems need to build in sufficient spare capacity and redundancy to make them more reliable and more resilient in the event that one or more components fail. And I know we've touched on that a lot. However, can you kind of continue on with your thesis about decentralizing the energy grid and the importance thereof?
Well, again, I think I can bring it home. As someone with an engineering background, I used to understand that, hey, I had a gut feel that when somebody lost their electricity, it was a big hassle. Well, I had no idea how badly that can affect you. We had a fire here in Blanchard, where I live, last summer, and we lost our electricity for like 3 days, just 3 days. But during that period, I had to get a backup generator. In fact, I used one of ours. But without that, for example, I have a freezer full of meat. It would have, and I mean, I paid, a lot of money. There's like 6 months worth of meat there. In addition to that, nothing in the house worked. In addition to that, the water, I work off of a water pump. I'm out here in a rural area, and the water pump didn't work. I didn't have water. The sewage didn't work because I couldn't flush the toilet. I mean, it was more than just a headache. It was like, wow, this is really pretty heavy. So I had to quickly figure out how to get water. I had to quickly figure out how to get my food and store my food. Fortunately for me, I had an immediate backup as an option. So I was able to save my critical circuits, but I didn't realize just how dependent I had become on the system. Even being in the rural area, I have to imagine that people in the city are even more dependent upon these kinds of systems, because you don't have room to grow your own garden necessarily like we do out here in the country land. So I think that this idea of repairing the system is just, again, it's an acknowledgement that things get old, they break. And I don't care what kind of system you're talking about. And when you have a system that is so centralized that one cog breaking an entire system can bring the system to a grinding halt, to me, just strikes me as a very flawed, essentially a flawed premise to start from.
I'm sure people in Texas are going to say, hey, you should hear about what we did and went through 1 year ago, or in February of 2021, I guess it was. And so in here in North Idaho last winter, there was a 3-day power outage in Coeur d'Alene area where my wife and I live, and we were without power for approaching 72 hours. Everything in the fridge was, luckily we didn't have 6 months worth of meat. However, we had just made a Costco run, and all of that was on the line. Our entire Costco run worth of food was on the line. We had to buy a bunch of ice, basically. Because we lived at that time in a house that was fueled only by electrical, we had nothing in the entire home. So shortly after the power went out, you could see your own breath in the home. There's no lights. There's no sewage. There's no toilets, no showers, no hot water in the showers. So we're essentially living outside, and we kind of grin and bared it. Luckily, there were some places in town that did have power where we could spend the day, but that was not a tenable situation for much longer than the 2 or 3 days for us. Granted, because of a lack of preparedness, but also because we were fully dependent on electrical heating, etc., and we had none of that. So it was probably 30 degrees in the house.
Yeah, and it's not just that. I mean, think about this. You might say, well, we got gasoline, we can get a gasoline generator. Well, most gas stations, they're electrically operated. So if you can't get electricity to the gas station, and many of them don't have backup generators. I've noticed even around here, I would say 30% of the gas stations I go to have backup generators. The others don't. And so now you don't have gas. So now how do you even get around? So it can bring life to a grinding halt, to the point where it's like, whoa. And to me, if you want to see a society break down, see a situation where people can't eat. I mean, heat's important, yeah, and but like where you can't get water, you might be able to go a few days without even eating, but you can't go long without water. And by the way, one of the things, of all of the things that has improved our society, by the way, as worldwide, if you want to take a look at one of the two things that have changed the way we live in a positive factor, nothing has had a higher impact on our life than our ability to clean up the water we drink and to deal with our sewage. This has got nothing to do with the medical industry, but you take away electricity, and now you've got to deal with your sewage. And in addition to that, you don't know how clean the water you're drinking is. So these are so fundamental that you take away these two things, and we're kind of back 300-400 years ago, and back pretty fast. So one of the reasons I do not support cutting back on hydrocarbons is that, again, I look at this in terms of how is it affecting humanity. And I would say that if you want to badmouth, say, even things like hydrocarbons, and I make systems that are renewable, so I can say this as someone that's part of this overall larger energy industry, is that if you want to take a look and badmouth any source of energy, just try living without it, especially hydrocarbons. Because remember, hydrocarbons, they provide nearly, I think it's 86 or 87% of the entire world's energy, and basically gives energy to 7 billion people. There's nothing else that can do that. You can badmouth hydrocarbons all you want, but without hydrocarbon energy, we won't be able to farm at the level we're farming now. You won't be able to get water and basic foodstuffs at the level we can get now. You won't be able to become mobile like you can now. I mean, just think about how profoundly that would affect the way we live. And so having a centralized system just compounds that.
Given us the ability to have clean farms where we raise cattle and the food we eat. And I also will add that the nutrition that we've been able to eat over the last, say, 150 years has also, I think, greatly improved our health, not the medical industry. You conclude the white paper with many of these disruptive issues, weather, war, regulation, monopolistic utility business practices can be effectively addressed by focusing on decentralizing energy and power access. While some forms of electrical generation, oil, coal, and nuclear are prohibitively expensive, there are many other forms of electricity, solar, wind, hydroelectric, and some forms of hydrocarbon sources that are well within the grasp of the public at large. If you add to the decentralization of power to the point where individuals and companies can possess their own EMP protected transportable systems, you truly put power back in the hands of the people. Can you kind of build on that as we kind of conclude here?
Again, this gets back to my very, very basic outlook on energy, which is, does it improve humanity's lot or not? Now, there is no such thing as a perfect energy. For example, I think the perfect energy is if we were able to not only A, design a fusion reactor, but B, scale it down to where you could put it in a car or you carry it around in a portable. Hey, that'd be great. Are we there yet? No, we're not even close. I know people out there are looking at this, but if we take a look at our other sources like fission, and whether you're looking at solar or wind, I believe that the best way to approach this energy issue is to take a look at the advantages all of these various sources offer and to be able to integrate them in a synergistic fashion. I don't see why there's any reason why we have to say pick solar or hydrocarbons or wind. That's why our systems are designed to work on many of these various sources, both renewable and non-renewable. So I think, however, though, if you again allowing for the fact that I have a high faith in humanity, and I ultimately believe that we will act as a group. Notwithstanding that there are large companies out there that really couldn't care less about humanity, but as a group of people, if science is allowed to build in an unfettered way, primarily from government influence, I think that we have an incredible future in front of us with regards to energy. I think, though, the one thing I would like to end this with is to remind people that whether you like one source of energy versus another, keep in mind that without energy, our lives wouldn't be anything to what we see right now, and we would be back 300 or 400 years in the past. Our lives would be nothing like we imagine now. And frankly, I think most people have come to take the energy sources that we use. We tend to take it for granted.
What's your hope for the future of humanity, and how does Patriot Energy Systems express that?
Well, my the company is in a sense, it's an expression of who I am, as well as the guys I work with. And so I like the whole idea of decentralizing because I've never been much into centralization processes anyway, and that includes the government. That's just my personal view. So the other thing is to give people a good product, something they can use. So for example, when we built our product, we could have done a number of things like take the McDonald's approach, which is to cut corners everywhere we could. So we could give you this product at such a cheap price that no one can compete. That's one thing. What we did is we took the other way. We actually focus on quality, because if used right, our systems should, with the exception maybe of batteries, they should withstand many decades of use outside. So we took that route knowing that it might be a little bit more money up front and some people might walk away, and we recognize that our products aren't for everybody. But for those people that do buy them, we're pretty proud of them. And I think as the industry opens up down the road, there'll be plenty of competition out there of what we're doing. And I think, again, the competition's good. I think it keeps, for manufacturers, it keeps us on our toes. Just the changes that we've made in our systems in the last year have been very positive for us. We've become very plussed on what we're doing, not to mention the fact that we're learning how to manufacture these things in less and less time. So the trend that I see is still positive. The things that I see that may disrupt some of this decentralization trend is really, it's really how much we allow the government to affect what we can do in our decision-making process as businesses. And number two, don't confuse large businesses with free enterprise. Most of these companies, whether you're talking about Google, Yahoo, um, Microsoft. These are companies that have very large government backing, and so it's not really free. It's not really free enterprise. In fact, we could go down this whole idea of patenting things, and that's a whole different process conversation we have in the future. So what I'd like to see is just ideally, if people could just be left alone, there'll be a lot of people out there that'll go down paths and they may then end up going nowhere. There'll be other people that will go down different paths and they may be much more successful. Just like children, let us adults learn by our mistakes. Kids do a pretty good job of that, and I think adults could do the same.
We've had the distinct honor of sitting down today with Thomas Quinlin, the founder of Patriot Energy Systems. Thank you so much, Thomas, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Justin. It was a pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine, and thank you everyone for listening. Thanks for watching the show. I hope you enjoyed it. Head on over to GoldSilverBitcoin.com, where we have a store where we're selling precious metals. If you have Bitcoin, you can send those to us. We'll send you gold and or silver, whatever you're choosing. Alternatively, if you have gold and silver and you want Bitcoin, feel free to send us the gold and silver and we will send you Bitcoin. This is a service that we provided for clients since 2012, since when we were opened. You can also peruse the store and see we have all sorts of prep and survival gear, storable food, etc. So thanks for watching the show, and thanks for heading on over to GoldSilverBitcoin.com.